I've been doing my master's research on revolutions and what maths can and cannot say about that. In particular, I've been looking at the Tunisian revolution, which is seen as the first social media revolution, and I felt that current models of that hadn't been able to describe how that globalizing effect of social media could talk about this dynamics of people interacting and sharing ideas. So I just started looking at what was out there and started trying to build my own models of that. So as it's a maths lecture, we start, as we always do, asking what makes us human. And also, as it's maths, there is a unique correct answer. And the answer is agency and our relations. They're the kind of things that we're interested in when we're looking at modeling people and how they interact. Fundamentally, people have choices, and we want to be able to represent that somehow. It's traditionally not something that maths has been great at doing, talking about how people do things, why they do them, so we're interested in that. It also follows from ideas in sociology primarily, where people are fundamentally results of their environment and also their interactions with other people. So they're things that are traditionally very outside the domain of maths and very in the domain of social sciences, and we want to bring that into the domain of maths so that we can talk about it and start to model it. I'm going to have to do a little walk over here each time. So one of the really nice ways of representing agency is using agent-based models, and we'll talk a lot about what they are. Also, to represent social systems, we want to talk about social networks and how people interact with each other and the relationships they have. And by combining those, we can look at complex social phenomena such as revolutions. So this talk's going to just start with the agent-based models and move to social networks to get an idea of how we can talk about complex social systems that seem very far outside the realm of maths. And then we'll make it a bit more specific and look at revolutions, some other models that people have made, and then look at the model I've been working on. So an agent-based model is mostly used when you want to talk about a system that's really complex and you can't say that much about it at a general level. So instead, you look at the tiniest parts of it and describe what they do, and then put loads of them together and see what happens. So an example might be that I've worked on and we'll look at a little bit is how birds fly. And you might have seen how birds flying through the air make these really beautiful patterns, and they're incredibly complex, but there's also some inherent order to that. And it'd be really, really difficult to describe that straight off in mathematical terms. Like if you were looking from a topological point of view, and you'd have to introduce like dynamics, and it would be really messy. But a way to actually approach that is you instead talk about what each individual bird is doing, and you say, you know, each individual bird wants to fly in the same-ish direction as people near it. Birds near it. Could be a side note. But then they also don't want to be too close, they don't want to crash into them, but they also don't want to be too far away. They don't want to be like the freaks on the side of the little flock. So you give all these individual birds these properties, and then you just put them into a flock and see if you're generating the right phenomena. And the real strength of agent-based models is that you get this nice back and forth between field data and observational data and something very mathematical and scientific, and you can run experiments on the hoof really easily. You just change a few parameters, see what that changes. So this is the point where I really want to start using code. That was amazing. Okay. So, yeah. So we're going to start by looking at some models of, what is that? Okay. I'm not sure that's going to work. I don't think that's going to work, but
I did get him to check it's the right thing.
yeah. Don't worry, it's not. I don't think. Oh, that's a shame. Just trying to work out how to do this. So I've got some code on my computer that I was hoping to show you through the projection, but this won't connect to my computer.
Do you want to visualize it? Do you want to visualize it? Leave your laptop on?
Yeah, that sounds good. Do you know how to do that?
Such a good thing to visualize? No.
Is that a lectern? Would someone describe this as a lectern?
So the lectern.
DocCam.
That sounds good.
Okay, nice.
And then there are buttons in the top left and right that you need to press on the.
Oh, nice one. Okay, cool. This will be interesting. So, last year I was looking a lot at biological systems, and I was really interested in how they could be used to model flocking of animals. And it turns out there's quite a. So I was particularly interested in starlings, but a simpler version of birds is a fish, it turns out. And wait a sec. Okay, so is that? There we go. How's that look to you guys? I don't need the light, hey? Where's that coming from? Can you see that? Okay. Yeah, there's a light. So fish obey these three basic properties. They want to cohere to each other, which means they want to be pretty close to each other, but they also don't want to crash into each other, that's separate, and they also want to point in roughly the same direction. And the reason fish are really easy to model doing this is because they look at every other fish in the, what do you call the thing of fish again? School. Well, then class. And they look at each one in inverse proportion to the distance from it, and it's pretty simple. That's all they do. If one's very close to it, they're thinking a lot about its direction, and if it's very far away, they don't really care that much, but they care a little bit. So anyway, you can. Well, this is going to be exciting. You can change like how much they want to stick together, and you get things like that. If they want to separate, they start running away from each other pretty quick. And if they want to align, you see they start pointing in the same direction. So anyway, yeah, fish are simple. They're nice. But, whoa, there's so many things happening right now. Starlings are a bit more interesting. This is so weird doing it at this angle. So, starlings are a bit more interesting. And starlings produce the really, really beautiful patterns that you see. They actually only look at their closest 6 neighbors instead of all of them. They only care about the closest 6. So that allows them to have bits that split off from the main group, as you can see there. This one's just running live, and you get these more complex dynamics. I think I can run it with about 500 birds or something on my computer. I've done some nice simulations with like 3,000 or something, and you really see that swooping thing. Actually, I've got one. I'll show you that. So, yeah, just that change in neighborhood really changes the dynamics you see in birds compared to fish. So that's that. So, yeah, that's what we're doing. Starlings. And now we've kind of got an idea of what agent-based models. Sorry, I'm not pointing at the right thing. Is that the right thing? Cool. So now I've got an idea of agent-based models and how they work and how we can start to talk about these complex systems using small bits. We want to start applying it to humans. A really interesting model that I kind of was inspired by an area of econophysics, which is this trendy area of research at the minute that applies statistical mechanical methods to studying social systems and specifically economics. I found this nice model talking about economic inequality, particularly in the US, and how typically you end up with the vast majority of people with very low incomes, and then a tiny minority with pretty much everything. And this paper was just looking at that phenomena and trying to talk about it. You end up building this quite neat model with like very few rules. You have agents, like just individuals, people, and they all start with one unit of wealth. And at each time step, you move time forward one little bit. And at each point, if every agent, if they have some money, they give it to one other individual chosen randomly. So it might be this one, and they go to 0. That looks exactly the same. And then this person is chosen randomly and gets 2. And you just move that forwards, and it seems like it's got this mechanism in terms of redistributing wealth through the society. It turns out that that's actually the complete opposite of the effect it has. You end up with this really unequal distribution of wealth. So this is, most people have 0 wealth by the end. And it's a really unusual result, and you can start to see how building these very simple rules can get really complex and surprising phenomena. And so the cool thing about agent-based models is you can just do experiments really quickly. So you say, what happens if we just give everyone more money? Will that end up being more distributed through society? And like, surprisingly, no, it doesn't. And you end up with exactly the same distribution, pretty much. You just need to wait a longer time for it to happen. The money ends up being distributed with the same distribution. Do you want to see a pic? No. I've got a nice little visualization of that, but I don't think it's that important. And interestingly, this seems to fit the data on income inequality. So it actually fits for the physicists here. It's a Boltzmann distribution, which is typically associated with systems that try to reduce their energy in some way, and for some reason it turns up here as well. So it's an interesting question, but also slightly unrelated to what we're talking about. So that's agent-based models. So that kind of covers how we can talk about agency in social systems. But next we want to talk about social networks and the relations people have with each other. So first of all, we have this. This is actually my Facebook network. So it's roughly, you can actually see it better in, this is from Reasons to Not Be Friends with a Mathematician. And basically it's because they make visualizations of their Facebook network and they just mine your data. So I have these of all my friends. So yeah, you guys are in it. Thanks. Thanks for the data, guys. So this is, these are all my friends from Newcastle, where I went to school and grew up. It's roughly split into 3. You can see this is Newcastle and school. These are my friends from Manchester. Unsurprisingly, my hall friends are completely separate from everyone else in my life. And then these are my friends from Montreal, where I spent the last year studying. And then you have a bunch of people who just don't have anything to do with anyone else over there. And it's kind of an interesting thing to do, and I'll write a little blog post in case anyone wants to do it, because it's quite cool actually to do. Sociopathic, but also cool. And it's quite funny because you see key people rise to the front in their connections, and it's I don't know, kind of a bit depressing as well. You kind of get your exes floating to the top, and but you also get your family and interesting connections between them. So there's some people who join between your two different circles or something. It's quite an interesting thing to do, and you can actually go like a little bit further. And where are we? I'm not quite used to this. How does everyone feel if we have one side? No, that's not going to happen. It's a one Excel thing. So this is my Excel sheet of my friends. This has all the details on their names, but also their eigenvalue centrality to my network, so how key they are linking other people. It's got their between centrality. And it's quite an interesting thing to look at. I don't recommend you tell people that you've done it, but it's kind of interesting to look at. But you eventually you're looking at that and you're like, okay, why am I doing this? Like, what am I doing with my life? And also, what could we use this for in the name of mathematics? And so there's a few things you typically look for in a social network, typical features that people have. And I haven't actually really defined what I'm talking about when I talk about social networks. I'm really talking about a graph. That's my little chalk. I'm talking about if this is me, and this is a friend, and this is a friend, and this is a friend, and this is someone I don't know yet. I'll be linked to these guys, and not linked to those guys. So you represent each person, even in the world if you want, as a dot, and you have a line between them if they meet some criteria. So what I was just showing you is friends on Facebook, but you could have anything. You could have acquaintances, colleagues, written a scientific paper with, been in a film with, like, you know, Kevin Bacon or whatever. You can do whatever you want. So the typical features of a social network are, this is a heavy-tailed sheep, which I didn't know existed, but they've got such heavy tails you've got to put a little pulley on their tail so they carry it along. Anyway, they have heavy tails. And that means that there's most of the nodes have, if we say pk is the probability of an individual, a randomly chosen node having k neighbors, k other nodes it's joined to. Heavy tail basically means that it's more like this one than this blue one, and that's to say that most people have a very low number of connections, but then there's some that have loads. And this ends up being really important. And it comes up in loads of areas of life. This is a graph of the internet and links to different pages. And you see that pretty much all of the links go to a few central ones. And they're called supernodes. And they play a really important role within that network. And you can do a lot of analysis of that network from just looking at those. So heavy tails are important. What else is important? Oh, they were a bit scary. But another thing is small world factors. And this has kind of come up in popular media quite a lot, in the idea that of 6 degrees of separation, that if you wanted to contact anyone in the world, there's 6. If you contacted one person, asked them to contact another, you could get to anyone within 6 degrees. And it turns out that's actually true and comes up in a lot of social networks. So that's the second feature. The other one is triangles. And every triangle is a love triangle when you love triangles. So fans of triangles will be pleased to know that social networks actually have triangles as a very fundamental thing within them. And so triadic closure, is everyone okay with this dual wielding kind of scenario? Okay, cool. So triadic closure means that if I have 2 friends, then they are more likely to know each other than 2 strangers. And it's really simple, but you end up with these quite close interconnected networks. So that's a third property, and they're all properties we want to model in some way. There's kind of two main ways of modeling social networks in like to form them. Is there? Yeah. One of them is the Barabasi-Albert model, and that in particular deals with the heavy tails thing we were talking about. And really briefly, what you do is you start with one node, and then you create another, and well, you join them. But then the third one, this one has a probability of joining to each of these nodes in proportion to the degree, the number of connections the nodes already have. So here it's equal. So let's say it goes there. And now when this one goes, this node is twice as likely to join to this one as this other one. So you end up building things which have these supernodes which take a lot of the edges. So that's the Barabasi-Albert model. It looks something like this. So you get these clusterings around a few supernodes. So that's a typical one. The other typical one is a Watt-Strogatz model, which is more aimed at, in particular, looking at the triadic closure and also the small world effect. And what you do with that, so you start with a ring. So you start with ring, and everyone is connected to everyone like this. It takes two parameters. One of them is the number it's connected to either side of it. So you can if you have everyone connected to the two neighbors either side of it, that's also what Strogatz model, but just for ease of drawing, I'll just do one. And then the other parameter is the rewiring probability, and that's the probability that. So this is the first phase. After that, the second phase, you go through each edge, and for each edge, you rewire it with probability beta. So let's say it's 0.2, you go here and it doesn't change, but you go here and you're rewiring this one, and so you take that away and attach it to another one chosen randomly in the network, so it might be this one, and you do that, maybe this one goes, that one ends up going over here, or something, and that one's going there, for example. And this is the Watt-Strogatz model, and you can see that it has tried it. Technically, this one doesn't have very good triadic closure, but once you change the numbers and names it has to 2 or 3 or 4, then I'm going to do that right now. Actually, it doesn't really make sense otherwise. It's just a bit hard to draw. Then you see that typically you do get these triangles. The exception is more when you don't have the triangles. So it has the triangles and also has the small world phenomena. So they're the two main random models we talk about when we're talking about doing a model on a social network. And they typically look like this. I think they're prettier, but there you go. And you can go back, now we can go back to this model we built of economic inequality, and we can, instead of having each one just randomly trading amongst the population, we can have each one having relations with other individuals in that population. So I think the most interesting option is when you put it on a Barabasi-Albert network, which was the one which showed the heavy tails and the supernodes. What you get is, that's my Excel. So I made this little visualization, and you have, that's actually a bit hard to tell what's happening. Each agent is now, each person is now a node in a graph, in a network. And we create it as a Barabasi-Albert network. So there's one, you can see there's one obvious supernode here, and there's a few which have quite a lot of connections, but then most of them just have one. And so you can just see what effect this has on the general network. And if we run it, I've got a measure of inequality on the bottom. You can see that the agent with the most, oh, fuck. Okay, whatever. The agent with the more nodes is consistently getting higher than 1, which means other people are consistently getting less than 1. So the network effects just make the inequality even worse, and you end up with a graph like this. And then if we plot the income inequality, the economic inequality again, you end up with this, which is so drastic you've got to put it on a log scale to even tell what's happening. But over 80% of the population now have 0, while a few have like 40 and things. Okay, so that's kind of the introduction to the two main bits of maths we want to use. We can now account for agency, and we can also account for relations between people. So we want to start putting this into models of revolution. The most cited model of revolution is Epstein's model of civil violence, and it's very focused on special processes, people meeting in the streets and talking and maybe getting caught by policemen, and they're just interacting with each other in the streets, which I think is really important throughout revolutions in like pre-digital societies. So like French Revolution, Russian Revolution, it's all really key. These people meeting in the streets, because there's not that you can meet through, like you can send information through newspapers or something like that, but typically it's not. People are talking in the streets. And I was interested in the Tunisian Revolution, which had social media as a fundamental part of it. But anyway, the Epstein model has people moving about on a square lattice. So you have something. So you have people existing in one of these squares, and they can either present as, there's a bunch of global parameters. This one's quite a complicated model, apart from anything else. It's got a lot of parameters, and I think a bit too complicated to explain in loads of detail, but it has parameters like the legitimacy of government and the hardships that the person is going under. And then you've got two types of people in the model. You have citizens, and you also have cops. And the citizens are basically, I don't know if there's any different colored chalk. No. But the citizens are looking around. So let's say this is a cop, and this is a citizen. The citizen has they've got a level of grievance that is calculated based on the government's legitimacy and also their hardship that they're going under. And so they have some level of grievance, basically. And they've got there's so much going on in this model, actually, but they have some threshold for how angry they are. So some people just don't really care much, and some people would, get angrier over very little. So you have someone's tolerance for injustice at different levels throughout the society, and then each individual citizen is looking around them to see if there's a cop nearby, and depending on how close they are, they either present as actively in the revolution or not. And it's a really complicated model, basically, but it's quite interesting and quite revealing. You can get some nice results. Like you can see that citizens, it's sometimes in their self-interest to be deceptive. So while they may feel that they want to be part of a revolution, they want to be active, if there's a lot of cops around or there's not many other people who are part of the revolution nearby, they won't do anything. You also get some really nice results about how if the legitimacy of the government is slowly decreasing, typically it's very hard to start a revolution. What you actually need is some sudden dip in legitimacy. So you do also see this in the Tunisian revolution. Sometimes you just need a spark to get things moving, and that in the Tunisian revolution happened with the self-immolation of a market seller. And a lot of people saw that through social media and started reacting to that. So it's really interesting, but it doesn't really take the key parts of social networks and things I've been looking at. So I was mainly interested in revolutions that are non-violent. In particular, there's a really nice book it's a long statistical analysis of revolutions throughout the last 100 years or something. And it showed that the majority of successful revolutions of the last 100 years have been non-violent, and there's actually a growing trend for them being more successful. And one of the really interesting things about it as well, one of the really striking facts, is that there's almost a threshold over which, if there's some percentage of the population being part of a revolution, it's almost destined to be successful. And it turns out that that number is 3.5%, which seems really low to me. So the result is saying that if there's over 3.5% of the population part of a revolution, there's almost always a successful outcome if it's non-violent. So it's made me want to focus more on non-violence, and it's also a bit simpler. You don't have to consider military efforts and just the dynamics of warfare. So I was interested in non-violence, and it also allows you to talk mainly about ideas, and that's the kind of central part of my model. And it was inspired by models of illness. And so mathematical epidemiology is this really well-developed area of maths that mainly talks about how illness is spread in a society. And there's some really nice research, and actually there's a really great Galois Group talk earlier in the year, I think, maybe last year, about how ideas were in some fundamental way quite like illnesses, in that they move through a society through this kind of osmosis and through contacts between people. And I was really inspired by this idea to talk about revolutions. And revolutions are kind of different in this fundamental aspect, in that if you have an idea about like cats or something, you're probably fine sharing it with most people. You're not really looking around the population, seeing if other people are talking about cats so much, if there's a danger to you in talking about cats. But with a revolutionary idea, there's this fundamental threat to your existence if you're in a rough regime or something. So I was inspired by this idea, and I wanted to see if there was a way to take all the techniques and models from mathematical epidemiology and start using them in a revolutionary context by adapting them for this like fundamental difference. So I started with this kind of compartmental model that's really typical in mathematical epidemiology, where you have people moving from susceptible, so they have, in the context of disease, that means they haven't come into contact with the disease and they haven't caught it yet. Exposed, which means they've been infected, but they're not yet infective. So they carry it, but they're not sharing it with other people. And then infective, which means they're actively sharing with other people. And removed, which comes after that point when they're removed from the population or stop, they're no longer infective. And so you can kind of do a quite simple, almost naive reinterpretation of this in terms of revolutions. You have susceptible as someone who either hasn't heard of the revolutionary idea yet or is not convinced by it. Exposed as someone who holds the idea and they believe in it, but they're not yet acting on it in any meaningful way. Infective is someone who holds the idea and is definitely acting on it and sharing it with other people. And then removed is someone who's left the population of infectives for some reason. Maybe they've become disenchanted with the movement, or they've been removed actively by the regime, or for whatever reason they're no longer part of that. So I did one model that was just a dynamical system. We won't really look at that right now. But anyway, it led to this more complex model, like an agent-based model. And like the key insights came from the Hms model, actually, that there's a fundamental difference between believing an idea and actually acting on it. And if you just believe it and don't act on it, it's almost the same as not having the idea, because people can't see that you're feeling that way, and so it has very little effect on the dynamics of the population. So I ran a bunch of simulations which showed that if everyone's believing something but no one's acting on it, nothing will happen. Even if a very small majority are acting on, a very tiny minority are acting on it, it doesn't really matter if everyone holds that idea. So like a key thing was that it's important to act on these ideas and revolutions. One thing you need to accommodate in a revolutionary model, as opposed to a model of disease, is that people in general are conformists, and they do what everyone else is doing. And there's some really nice experiments in social psychology called the Asch conformity experiments. And they actually just have, it's really simple, but they have 3 lines like this, like 1, 2, 3. And there were some actors planted in there, and basically if they were asked to say if these 2 were the same length, and if obviously in the absence of anyone like fucking with them, they would just say, no, they're obviously not the same length. And if one person says they're not the same length, people will still say the correct answer. And if 2 people are saying it, like some people start to dally and start saying they're the same length. But 3, once you get to 3, for some reason people are like, yeah, they're the same length. So basically people are conformists and they act as other people are acting. And so I was inspired by this idea for my model in a big way, and thought that if other people are actively part of revolution and sharing it, then you need about 3 people to start sharing the idea yourself, if you believe in it, that is. So that's the kind of fundamental idea behind what I was doing. And you end up, so a bit more concretely, you have a network, and I was just going between the different ones we looked at. And what the model would do, actually I've got a nicer simulation that will show it for you. Okay, so you end up with, I made this kind of sandpit for playing about with basic ideas and just presenting it here. In practice, it ends up having loads more nodes. I ran it around with several 100,000 in the end, once you don't have these visualization elements. But what you do is you have this infective node. Would it be better if I had this on both? Yeah. No, that's exactly the wrong thing. So you have all these parameters on the left, some about the network, some about different parameters, about someone's chance of being infected upon contact, chance of moving from exposed to infective, and the threshold around that. And what you do is you infect one person with the idea here, and you just run that to see what happens. So at the moment, I've got this thing called the basic reproduction number as really high. If it's over 1, it's likely to spread more. And it's 13, just so I can show you what typically happens. So it moves from red
and then some people get exposed, but no one else is acting, so they don't do anything. So it's spreading, the idea is spreading, and then suddenly some people become exposed and it starts moving through the population really quickly and taking over. And the grey lines represent that it's no longer able to pass through that connection. And for people who've studied like mathematical epidemiology or mathematical biology, you can see that the pattern is quite similar to the ones you typically get in disease spreads. But if you do it on a lot more, if you do it on a lot bigger network, you end up with something that's a lot sharper. You get this very sharp increase in effectives. And that's from this, I didn't draw it out, but the Asch conformity experiments made me choose a threshold that looks a bit like this, and this is around 3. So for someone exposed with the idea, if they have 3 neighbors who are being active and sharing it, they will tend to move from exposed to infected. And just introducing that gives you this sudden outbreak in revolution that's very typical in revolutions. I've actually got more, but you get some interesting things. I made these measures of how the ideas spread in a population versus how the action spreads, and it turns out that the idea spreads much further and much quicker than the actual action. So it might be like a comforting thing for revolutionaries that even if the action they're part of looks really small, they're kind of spreading the seeds for future revolution in different cities throughout it. And that's also how the Tunisian revolution happened. It started in this one very specific place, but the seeds of discord were sown like around the cities, and it ended up spreading throughout it and leading to the president's withdrawing. So there's a bit more about, you can do this interesting extension where you allow the regime to be a player in this kind of game, and you allow them to remove nodes by choice. And you get some really interesting results about what networks are preferable for revolutionaries to be part of. It turns out that these kind of distributed ones where people are connected to a lot of people, and you don't have those super nodes with someone in a lot of control. So the message there is kind of these distributed, democratic, broad-based networks are a lot more, they have a lot higher toleration for regimes that are trying to pick them apart. So that's pretty much it. There's some interesting things for like future people working on this to do. I think it'd be really interesting to combine this kind of epidemiological approach that I didn't actually get that much time to talk about, but with the kind of hard stats that I was talking about, this statistical analysis that has loads of detail about how, if revolutionary movements have gender inequality within them, how that affects it, and all these things that would be really cool to be modeled with something like Epstein, which has all these global variables about legitimacy and things like that. Yeah, so thanks for listening, and all the code is open source and you can access it here. So if you want to like make any of the pictures with the birds or fish or anything, or just explore how the revolutionary models that I've built work, and also the dynamical systems one that I didn't actually get to talk about, that's all free and available, and you can do whatever and copy it and say it's yours from here if you want. So thanks. And if there's any questions, then yeah. Hey.
How did you do that stalky thing with Facebook did?
Oh, I'll make a little blog post and I'll send it out. But it's quite easy. It's not too hard. You can do it with very little coding currently. The Facebook privacy data keeps on changing so much that, like, if I tell you I'll do it today, it might be slightly different tomorrow. I tried to do it about before the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and it worked well, and then it kind of Cambridge Analytica happened, and it got a bit harder, and then I worked out how to do it again. So it kind of Depends if you're asking for now or next week. But there's
Sound interesting.
yeah, there's something that scrapes your Facebook friend list, and then it will go onto their profiles, and most people have their friend data as public. So then it's looking at the edges that it can then connect to your mutual friends. Yeah. and then from that you can take it into any like standard statistical package and analyze the graph data, and then yeah. You're in it.
Yeah, that's on.
Hey.
Who's the most central person in that one?
My ex, and then also my best friend. Yeah, they're people who both lived in Newcastle and then lived in Manchester, so they kind of join these two areas. And most centrality indexes look at paths between people, and if someone can connect a lot of different people, like my best friend can, who was in Newcastle and Manchester, they have this really important role in the network. Not as important as me, because like you're always the center of your social network, but the second most after that.
So you got the 3.5% figure for
Right.
active participants in a revolution.
Yeah.
How does that link to like the neighbors? Do you have like a corresponding value for like the neighbors around you in like the local region for you to like turn to that idea?
Right, so the 3.5% is this statistical result from this book I was talking about, which is of the global of the countrywide population. If 3.5% are part of a movement, it'll typically be successful. And it's an interesting question how that links to local effects. That's the benefit of a network model, is you can look at these specific localized effects that no one's done yet. And it might be that if you have really high participation in one city, that's loads more meaningful than this really spread out population, but there's no data on that.
Okay, and is there like information on how that figure of 3 changes based on how like ridiculous idea
I don't
you're
know.
trying to
No.
get this one to agree to?
No, this one's quite well confirmed, and it's like a classical result in social psychology that comes up all the time. And that's been repeated a lot. And so basically it just does have a pattern like this, like less than 3 doesn't really affect people much, and then much more than 3 doesn't make them any more conformist. If you're not conformist, you don't really care how many people are agreeing or disagreeing with you. So no, I don't know, like, I mean, this is about as ridiculous as it gets. Like, you're looking at different lines that are literally different sizes, and so obviously different sizes. That's about like on the ridiculous spectrum over there. So I suspect maybe 2 or 1 for like ideas where you're kind of questioning it yourself. But it's important for like boardrooms, and a lot of like organizational psychology looks a lot at this, because if you're in a boardroom with a lot of people, you can be driven to really horrific things a lot more easily.
Did you try the numbers up?
Yeah, it's one of the parameters in my model, so you can change that really easily. You can play with it yourself, but it changes the length. Typically, it changes the length that this slow period. Where is it? This slow period at the start. It typically changes how long that happens, and also the likelihood of complete wipeout and nothing happening at all. So it makes this period where people are just thinking about things. So the important thing is like the ideas are increasing here, and then the action actually catches up with it later. That was kind of like a key thing I really wanted to model, and this one manages to do it. And I think having that lower threshold would keep this roughly the same, but I think the action would either come, typically it comes loads later or not at all. So you can end up with loads of people with the idea of revolution, but no one actually acting on it. If you're requiring too many people that you need to conform with. Anything else? Yeah.
How similar did you compare how similar your Facebook network was to the Arabasi Alpha?
I didn't actually, but that'd be really interesting to do. It wasn't such a key part of what I was doing, it was just illustrative in my thing, but I think it would be interesting to look at it a bit more. And just from eyeballing it, there are some like really key supernodes in it. So I think it would look quite similar. But also because of these
because of like the triadic closure effect, you end up with a lot of people with around like 5 mutual friends, and less with like 0. So I think it'd be, instead of like this distribution you associate with scale-free networks, which is more like here, like that, I think you'd probably get something a bit more like that, where you have very few people with actually 0 relation to the rest of your network, and very most of it around there. All right. Well, thanks a lot for coming. Yeah, it's great to have you. And if you want to ask anything, just feel free after. Cheers.